begin our painting, we need to look at our value sketch and check out the composition, as well as the different values we used. Let's start our painting by getting some cadmium yellow ready. I've added a lot of water to the cadmium yellow, and that way it's going to be easy for me to create the wet into wet technique that we're going to be using. I'm starting by covering the top part of the painting and adding water as I go along. Not necessarily adding more yellow, but adding more water so that it's good and wet. Covering the area I'm wanting, and then leaving some white spaces. Looking carefully at my reference photo, I can see how I want the sky to be laid out with the different colors. I'm now going to rinse out my brush and get the yellow out of it so that I can add some of the cobalt blue up in that one corner where the white is. I want to be careful about putting the blue on so that it doesn't mix with the yellow too much and turn the sky green. I'm now rinsing out my brush again, and I'm coming to get some of the orange. The orange also needs to be very watery, so that when I place it right on top of the watered yellow, it's going to automatically granulate and just cause those clouds to form. Thinking carefully about clouds and how when the sun is setting, the color is towards the bottom of the cloud, and generally there's shadows up towards the top, and also some reflection a little bit on the bottom from the water below. Now I'm mixing some of the cobalt blue with a little bit of the red, mixing a nice dark violet. I can use it for some of the shadowed areas in the clouds, creating a nice contrast between the yellow and the orange and the violet. Notice how I'm holding my brush as I lay the color on the paper. Sometimes I'm holding it sideways, and that way I can cover more area. And when I just want to dab the brush onto the paper, I'm holding it more straight up and down. Adding one more layer of color on my sunset clouds, I decided to go ahead and put some more dark cobalt blue down around the bottom to emphasize that shadow or the darkened area. One of the things I love about working with watercolor is watching how it changes as you work through your painting. You can paint something and then 5 minutes later, especially if it's wet into wet, it's going to look a lot different. And that's what happened here. I decided I wanted to emphasize some of the lighter sections, that it got kind of dark. So I'm doing what's called a lifting method. I'm taking my brush, I'm rinsing it out really well, and then I'm wiping it out on my paper towel. I'm simply brushing that on the paper, and it lifts the color off. And I thought it might be nice to have some kind of fluffy areas and soften some of the areas that just seem kind of harsh and hard. Softening those areas really makes it look more cloud-like and focuses more on the texture instead of the color. When you are lifting, make sure that you are rinsing and wiping your brush off frequently so that you're not just moving paint around on the paper, that you're actually lifting it up. I'm now starting on the water. This will be the two lower thirds of the painting. Just like I did up in the sky, I'm starting out with the yellow. And also like I did in the sky, I'm leaving some of the white of the paper showing. Now that my sky is almost dry, I'm noticing that I want to darken some of the cobalt blue and add a little bit more darkened areas. So I come in with my brush and just simply brush it on. It's damp enough that I'm still getting some granulation, but I'm also lifting and softening the edges so it won't be quite so hard. I'm now adding some yellow to the bottom third of the paper, and then coming in with the orange and trying to reflect what is seen in the sky. That's the secret. Your horizon line will be your line of symmetry, and on both sides of that line of symmetry you have the same thing. You have the sky, and then you have what is reflected into the water. So it's going to be exactly the same thing, only opposite. However, when it reflects in the water, you're going to get a little bit of abstraction. It's not going to look exactly like what it does up in the sky. Now I'm coming in with some cobalt blue and adding water closer to me in the bottom third. As you're going down that bottom third, the water gets darker as it gets closer to you. So I'm mixing up some of the red and the blue together and creating the darker section, that bottom third. Always going horizontally and always thinking about waves. So as I use the brush back and forth, I'm using the tip of it. I'm now looking at my photograph and I'm putting in just some basic shapes where the ships are in the background. Since this is still wet, it's going to cause the shapes to not be exactly the way I want them the first time. So I'm just kind of putting in the darkened areas so I know the location and where I want to put them. I'm also coming in with my brush and I'm creating a little bit of reflection underneath. Now that that has dried, I've mixed up a very, very rich and dark violet. Once again, using the cobalt blue and the red. More blue than red, and it needs to be thicker, so don't add very much water to it. And I'm coming in and really painting in the shapes of those boats, thinking about the space in between them where the light shines between them. If they have windows, how the light shines through the windows. It wouldn't be one solid shape because you've got some of the water showing between the boats. Also doing the same thing in the ones that are in the background if you have them. Then I'm coming in with my brush and I'm making it as pointed as I can so I can add the reflections of the masts on both the smaller boats as well as on the larger boats. I'm going to make sure that I'm looking at that resource photo again to get them in the right location. The key here is using your hand back and forth and jiggling it back and forth so that it looks like a reflection in the water. It's okay if it's not a solid line. It's okay if parts of it are a little bit darker than others. In fact, closer to the boat, it's probably going to be a little fuzzy. I like to take my brush and kind of go back and forth after I've done those just to show some fine lines in the water. Now I'm very carefully placing the vertical masts above the boats, making sure that, thinking of symmetry again, that they're in exactly the same place as what I put in the water. The reason why I waited to do the ones in the sky first is because I wanted to make sure that sky was nice and dry before I attempted this. If it's not, it's going to granulate just like your sky does, and you're not going to get very much detail. It's just going to be a big blob. Look at your resource photo and think, what details can I add that's going to make this interesting? Looking at those crossbars, maybe some ropes that are coming down from the top, the triangular shape of some of them. Now I'm using my smaller brush and I am taking that rigor and I'm making some of the smaller mass of the boats in the background. Doing some of the same things I did before, except this should probably be done with a lighter value paint and it's not going to be quite as large. I'm noticing a few places on my boats that I want to add some even richer violet paint. Watercolor painting is all about creating layers. I started out with a light layer first, then it got darker, and this is my richest and darkest value. It adds the shadow. It also adds the individuality of each one of the boats. It allows you to form them and make them look more three-dimensional. Same thing with the water. I started out with the lighter blue, then I went in with a darker value, a mid value, and the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start putting in some darker lines coming across. Especially in the lighter areas, you don't want to put too much in there, but just enough to make it look like there's waves. If you need to practice on a separate piece of paper before you start this, you can. But hopefully your value sketch helped when you were working on it to kind of get the technique down first. Mixing up an even darker value for the violet so that as that water gets closer to you, it's getting darker and it helps with the illusion of distance. I'm almost dry brushing the paint on that bottom part so you can see how I drug the brush across and the paint wasn't really wet. And here is the finished painting.